it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our discussion panel for today, which is chaired by Liz Armstrong, who is retired Vice President of Instruction and former interim president of San Diego Mesa College. Paying us a very welcome visit. The panelists, which we have chairs for everybody, I believe, yes, will consist of student body president Cherie Deogracias, just wave to the people, and Sondra Frisch, who is emerita professor of humanities and professor in the president's office, and MacKenzie, who is professor of psychology, and Thekima Mayasa, who's professor of Black Studies, and Akunna Winston, who's professor of business. So I now give the floor to Elizabeth Armstrong.
Well, thank you, Nidia. Thank you for that introduction, and I'm very pleased to be at Mesa today. As some of you know, I was at Mesa for several years and retired, and although I enjoy retirement, it's really nice to be here with friends and colleagues and students today at a college that I love very much. I want to thank Nina for being the organizer of this series. I know it's a lot of work to get speakers and make all the arrangements, so thank you, Nina. And thank you also to Jonathan McLeod, who I think worked with you on this. Let me start by saying something about the title of it. You've come a long way, baby, or have you? A strange title for this workshop. For some of us, me in particular, this has great resonance. 1978 saw the introduction by the Philip Morris Company of a new cigarette aimed at women. It was called Virginia Slims. And this was their promotional slogan, "You've come a long way, baby." And it was something that we all recognized. I'm not a smoker. I'm not putting this up here to promote smoking, but just to simply say that that was the slogan in 1978. Now, we hadn't come a long way in 1978, but a lot has happened in the intervening 40 years or so. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, as well as the status of women in the United States, in the world beyond. I have to apologize at this point. I'm not a social scientist by training. My background is in sciences. I taught chemistry for many years before becoming a college administrator. And so therefore, as I put this PowerPoint together in a presentation, I may have missed some things that a social scientist who studies the women's movement may feel is critical or important, or may have misinterpreted. So my apologies first. This is the viewpoint of somebody who's lived through the women's movement, who's benefited from it, and feels that it's still alive and well and very critical and important today. And Nina introduced the speakers. Here are names in order, alphabetical order, and myself at the top, and then names. I'm very appreciative that panelists have agreed to participate. We'll get a much more varied viewpoint because of that. And this is another iconic illustration. How many of you have seen this before? That's terrific, okay. And this really is the Rosie the Riveter, and Rosie the Riveter. And it represents the women of World War II who went to work, left their homes, went to work in factories, in munitions factories, building aircraft, tanks, what have you, in order to support the war effort and help the United States and the world win World War II. And it represents the pride that women felt in being able to participate fully in society, their capability. It represents them as strong and important. What we're going to cover today is, first of all, a very, very quick history of the women's movement and the achievements in the past 40 years in particular. And then we'll take a break for a panel discussion to respond to one question. We're taking a break in the middle because I know that some of you will have to leave before the end of the session at 2 o'clock. Then I'll continue with a PowerPoint on the status of women today in the United States and globally, and particularly looking at what's happening with the economy and women here and beyond. And then we'll finish with a panel discussion again on another question, and then we'll take questions and answers from you as you see fit. So the early history of women. Many of you know that life, until very, very recently, was hard for everybody. Lives were short, longevity was very short. People died in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Very few people lived that long, men and women. And that was true in the world as a whole. For women in particular, they had no legal rights or no voice in their own lives, no ability to decide how their lives would go. They were treated as chattels. That is, that they were property to be disposed of by fathers, by husbands. And marriage was basically, for those who could afford it, it was basically an economic or a political act. People got married for economic reasons. Politically, they were to forge unities between countries, between states, and that was really the major reason for marriage. Inheritance laws were such that women could not inherit and keep their property if they married. So if a woman inherited property, when she married, it became her husband's to dispose of. And that led to all kinds of things where women were forced into marriages because of the interest in their husbands in taking over their property. And one side note here, in certain countries, particularly in Middle and Central Asian countries, bride kidnapping was something that was practiced fairly routinely and still is occasionally today. I have a son-in-law who's Bulgarian from Eastern Europe, and he's attended weddings in which reenactments of bride kidnapping occur. So there's a memory of what used to happen and still does happen. And bride kidnapping was part of the lack of voice that women had on their ability to control their own lives. We read frequently of women who had positions of power throughout history. People like Catherine the Great, Cleopatra, Elizabeth I of England, but they were few and far between. They were not the norm. They were seldom, and indeed they had to behave as men in many cases in order to try to make their point. For example, Queen Elizabeth I said when the Spanish Armada was attacking England in 1588, she made a very famous speech at the docks in Tilbury, and she said, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a man." And so she had to make the point that here she was the leader of a country that was about to get invaded, but she was not really a woman, she was a man. She was able to do what a man could do. So I want to make the point that women were in positions of power were few and far between. Most women had lives which were difficult, which were short, which were unhappy, and those who had any property typically lost it upon marriage, and their marriages were controlled by their family. I want to deviate here and give an example. In the preparation I was doing for this seminar, I did lots of reading, both on the typical women's movement literature, but also on other things. And I revisited a novel that I read many years ago. Some of you may have read it. It's Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy. It was written in the 1850s, 1860s. It's not about the women's movement, but it's probably his masterpiece. It's maybe one of the most best novels ever written. If you do read it, be prepared. It's well over 1,000 pages. But in that, Anna Karenina, an upper-class woman who has everything. She's married because it was the right thing to do. She has a traditional marriage. She has everything she could want. She meets a man and falls in love, and a man called Count Vronsky. And she ultimately ends up having a child by him and leaving her marriage. And what happens to her is that Vronsky is able to continue on with his life. He can go about in society, people accept him, he can go about his business, and life is normal for him. But for her, she's shunned by society. Nobody will accept her, nobody will talk to her. And she spirals downward and downward into an abyss where she's taking drugs, she is despondent, she believes that Vronsky no longer loves her, and she ends up throwing herself under the wheels of a train. She commits suicide. In the novel, it's contrasted with other women, Anna's sister-in-law Dolly, who's the typical wife, the downtrodden. She accepts her husband's affairs. She believes that she has no voice in her life. She has to cope with a husband who spends money in ways other than what the household needs. So what Tolstoy is doing is he's contrasting these two lives. A woman who wanted to lead her own life, Anna, who cannot and ends up committing suicide. Now, life is very different today than it was in the 19th century, but that points out the difficulty that women have in having any control and choices in their own life. In the 17th and the 18th centuries, the Enlightenment was an incredibly important movement. Many people, Voltaire, John Locke, Spinoza, I think he was 16th century, Rousseau, Descartes, they talked about the need for logic, using logic for reasoning, for rational thought and decision making. And in particular, they placed a focus on human rights, including women's rights as well, saying that people should have rights based upon rational thought and reason. And the Enlightenment led to major social changes and upheavals, things including the French Revolution, the American Wars of Independence, and it ultimately led to freeing the serfs in Russia in the 1850s or 60s, and then of course the freeing of the slaves about the same time in the United States. So the Enlightenment was a very, very important part of history. It was also the time when science began to really become modern science. Before that, my subject, chemistry, was alchemy, magic, trying to convert things into what they were not. But the Enlightenment led to changes in science and modern thought in science as well. So people like Lavoisier, Dalton, and so on are associated with that. So the Enlightenment basically began to promote the idea that women should have the same rights as men. And one woman in particular is thought of as critical in this path. Mary Wollstonecraft was an English woman who lived an untraditional, unorthodox lifestyle for that point in time. And she ran away from her family. She was a writer. She was a good writer. She supported her family, her brothers, her fathers and sisters. But she ran away to live her own life, went to France, and lived with a Frenchman and had a child by him. It was scandalous at the time. But she was an author. She wrote several novels, and she wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792. And in it, she said that women are not naturally inferior to men, but they appear to be so because of the lack of education, and that women should not be treated as commodities. So she argued for equality for women and the same fundamental rights for women as for men, and that she argued that education for women was essential if they were to participate in society, and that because women are the center of the home and bring up children, that they need to be educated because they're educating the children of the future. So she was a very important thinker and is sometimes thought of as the first person associated with the women's rights movement. In the 19th century, two American women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, came to the fore. And both of them were social activists and abolitionists. So they came to the fore when they were fighting the slavery movement. But they also created, particularly Elizabeth Stanton, created the first organized women's rights and suffrage movement. And in 1848, there was the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls in New York. Now, as time went on in their fight for women's rights, they fell out with people who were supporting and promoting the 14th and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Those amendments would add legal protection and voting rights for African American males. But Cady Stanton and Anthony said that they would not support that as long as women were not given the same rights. So there was a schism between in the abolitionist movement and the women's movement at that time because of these differing opinions. The women's movement then led eventually to the votes. And the early part of the 20th century was marked by the suffragist movement. And the suffragettes were often very much involved with the abolition of alcohol, which did tremendous damage to families throughout the Western world. New Zealand is sometimes said to be the first country to give women the right to vote in 1893. There's some debate about that. In fact, at one point in time, much earlier than this, the state of New Jersey actually gave women with property the right to vote, but it was for a very limited period of time, and that went away. In 1918, the United Kingdom, my home country, gave women of 30 years of age or older the vote, and that was an outcome of World War I, where women had become much more active in society. It was 1920 before the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which gave women in the United States the vote. The movement towards suffrage has continued in countries throughout the world. And if you go on to Wikipedia, you can find a list of when countries have given suffrage. The most recent, I believe, was Kuwait in 2005, and Saudi Arabia is coming in 2015, I think. It's in, okay. Women in Saudi Arabia are not allowed to drive. Can you believe it? They're not allowed to drive. And there was a case very recently of women who decided they were going to drive to draw attention to it. And one woman was tried in court and found guilty because she drove. Subsequent to that, a few months later, she died in a traffic accident. 20th century progress. So World Wars I and II were really important in that women now left the homes and began to contribute to the war effort. They worked in factories and all kinds of work because men were at the front. But in both cases, they were expected to leave work and go back to the home when the men returned from the front. In the early 20th century, most women's jobs were, working women were single. The jobs required little education or training, so they were poorly educated usually, and they were usually things like factories or domestic service. The few women who had careers typically were unmarried, and you could not actually stay in some jobs if you got married or if you had children. School teachers were expected to leave if they got married or if they had a child. I remember in my high school in the 1950s or early 60s that when a teacher got pregnant, she disappeared from the school on the spot. So times had not changed that much in that period of time. In the 1930s to 1950s saw increasing participation of women in the workplace, with both single and married women now participating. And the positions began to require more education and more training, and part of it is due to the high school movement, in which there was a push to get as many people educated with some high school education as possible. So they began to move into work like secretaries, office workers and teachers, and these were jobs which traditionally until that point in time were done by men. So you also see parallel to this a change in the jobs where men are. Men are moving out of these, women are moving in, and they are begin to be relegated to the term pink-collar jobs. However, women were still primarily a contingent labor force. They weren't careers, they were jobs. They moved in and out as circumstances dictated. I'm now going to move to some information on laws and policies. United Nations actions have been important worldwide as well as in this country. And 1946 saw the formation of the Human Rights Commission, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, a very, very important woman in the United States at that point in time and beyond. And voting rights for women were introduced into international law. The United Nations also developed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that'll be on the next slide, and in 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. which the US has not yet ratified. It's one of about a handful of countries that include Yemen, Somalia, Iran, that have not ratified it. The first one, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21 says everyone has a right to take part in the government of his country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. And it also says, I won't read the whole thing here, you can see it there, but I've underlined universal and equal suffrage. And then CEDAW, again, is a long statement here, I won't go through reading it, but basically it's saying there will be no discrimination or distinction on the basis of gender or sex. So women should be able to participate fully. The National Organization of Women, or NOW, has been extraordinarily important in pushing forward ideas for legislation for women. They believe that women should have an equal voice in society, they should be protected by the laws equally, and they should have equal pay for equal work. The first president of NOW was Betty Friedan, and they put together initially the Bill of Rights for Women. You can find this on the internet, all of this is very easily retrievable. And they urged passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA. The Equal Rights Amendment was initially proposed back in the 1920s. And state by state it was ratified, but it never received enough states to become an amendment, and it died in 1982, which is astonishing. And here's the statement here. So NOW is currently urging the United States Congress to ratify the United Nations CEDAW statement, the one that was just before. The Rousseff Revolution, this term is coined by an economist at Harvard, Professor Claudia Golden. She then talks about what has happened to women throughout the 20th century, and that in the 1950s and 70s there were increasing labor demands which then promoted women coming into the workforce. There was increasing higher education for women which made them more eligible for work beyond very menial tasks. But most women were still secondary earners in the home in pink-collar jobs. So they were not really considered careers. So secretaries, teachers, nurses, social workers, librarians. And most of those tend to be lower paid than jobs that men were doing that might be similar. In the 1970s, then, the Quiet Revolution, this is another term coined by Claudia Golden. And in the 1970s, the pill was introduced. Now, the pill was a massive undertaking of science. The compound that's the major compound in the pill was extracted from plants, and chemists were involved in looking at different ways of modifying it. It was called Deogracias, who was a professor at Stanford, who was responsible for moving this along and into production. But the pill gave women themselves control over their childbearing, so they could decide when to have a child, when it would work for them, for their careers, for their families. They could space children. And society was now beginning to consider that it was worthwhile to invest in higher education for women. And certainly I remember growing up that although I was given a very, very good education, there was always the belief that, well, you're going to go, you need to be well trained and well educated because perhaps you will have to fall back on it in case something happens to your husband. That was always the thought. And there was also the belief that women shouldn't hold jobs because they may be taking a job that a man should have. That was something that many of us were subject to. Well, why are you applying for that job? You're taking a job that a man should have. Women now are able to embark on careers. They're not beholden in the same way. So what begins to emerge are issues of career and family balance. This is a book that's available on Amazon.com. You can download it to your Kindle. It's really good reading. It was written in 1989. It was based upon work done by a professor from UC Berkeley who interviewed families, the men and the women in families, over a period of 20 years. And she wanted to find out how they balance the demands of family, career, looking after households, and what they do to try to figure out what works. I'm not going to go into all her findings here, but it's well worth looking at because it's still relevant today. Every young man and woman who together form a household, whether married or not, have to deal with those same kinds of things. Who takes out the garbage? Who picks up the kids from school? Who makes sure the children do their homework if there are children? What's the balance? And families work it out in very many different kinds of ways. At one time, housework and looking after children was considered just the woman's job. So a woman would work, come home, and do all of that. Now there are much better balances occurring with young men, as far as I can tell, and women in some cases. No, I see some people saying no. It's iffy. Okay. This is a very interesting book anyway. It's something that continues. Civil Rights Act of 1964 is often thought of as focusing on diversity diversity, but not gender. But it really ends discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, and gender as well. And it re-energized the women's movement, and as part of it, President Lyndon Johnson signed Executive Order 11246 in 1967, which required the inclusion of women specifically in the award of federal contracts. Another law, Congressman Patsy Mink, but she was the main person associated with Title IX, which again says no person shall be excluded on the basis of sex from participation in an individual education or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And it's been mostly associated with athletics in the popular mind. However, it has had a huge impact on education. So when you look around your college classes today, you will see that women tend to be in the majority. That was not the case in 1972 when this was passed. In athletics, the number of women who play high school sports has increased dramatically. You see the numbers here. I don't have it for college sports, but it's had a huge impact. In the military, I'll just touch on this, although I don't have a lot of information on it. In the 1970s, Western armies, including the United States, began to admit women into active duty. And the combat roles gradually began to open up. In 2010, there was finally a policy approved authorizing women to serve on submarines. And then just last month, there was an expansion of combat roles for women in the US military to allow them to compete for jobs on the front lines in many cases. In education today, across the United States, for every 2 males that earn a bachelor's degree, there are 3 females. So women now are 60% of higher education. And that's a dramatic shift. Today, men are more likely than women to hold only a high school diploma. And what we know is that the high school diploma really is no longer the entry into a good middle class life as it once was. Now a college degree or some training, college training is important. And workplace leadership styles are tending to favor styles we typically associate with women, not all, but the idea of command and control leadership that was traditional some years ago is giving way to a more transformational style where the leaders coach individuals, they encourage, they're empathetic, they're motivational. And similarly, in the classroom, the things that women are good at, reading, writing, collaboration, empathy, those are the things that tend to be more helping them get ahead in the classroom as well. There is an increasing female workforce over that period of time. So from the 1970s onwards, we've gone from 48% of women having some kind of paid employment to 64%. And this data is for 2010. We're seeing women increasingly in fields which were traditionally male to here. Dentists have gone from almost nothing, 2%, up to 30%. Lawyers have gone from, again, almost nothing, 4% to 32%. So incredible increases. Doctors as well. College degrees for people in the 25 to 29-year-old age range. 36% women, 28% of men. So huge shifts that are going on. And the gains for women in employment are greater in the public employment sector than in business and private sector. And some people say that that's because of the legal framework, that the public sector is more responsive to the need to follow equal employment laws. And so women have made greater gains there than in the private sector. The trend, however, halted in the 1990s, and so today's young women who are entering the workforce are more likely to be working in occupations that are traditionally more female than male. That's a worrying trend. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that today, 2012, women hold 51.4%, staggering, of managerial and professional jobs. Half of all banking jobs, accounting and insurance jobs. 1/3 of physicians, I took that on the other slide. 45% of law firm associates. So these are the middle-level jobs. It's a massive shift, and as you see a little bit later in our presentation, there aren't so many women at the top, but in the middle. So what will life be like in the workplace in 20 years' time as these women then have their careers begin to evolve? It's going to be a very interesting time. However, to contrast that, 4 in 10 of women who are mothers are the primary family breadwinner, and many of them are single women, sometimes lower income, getting by on close to minimal wage. And so there's a major crisis there for a large group of the population. Economic contributions of working women. If you look at 2-earner families in middle and upper income ranges, that's the norm. The idea of the father being the breadwinner, going out to work, the mother staying home, that's very much in the minority today. I'm not saying here for lower income. Lower income, more and more families are led by women alone. Employers now have a much wider range of employees because they have, instead of 50% of the population to choose from, they have 100% of the population. And so they're able to get the best talent because they have so many more people to choose from. National economies benefit because we have more people, men and women, paying taxes. And MacKenzie has calculated that the additional women who've entered the workplace have added about 25% to the economy of the United States. I'm not quite sure what the time frame was for that. That was reported in The Economist magazine. So at this point, enough from me. I've talked a little longer than I meant to. I'm going to invite our panelists to please come up and take a seat. But what we're asking is for our panelists to reflect these 2 questions here together. The first is, in what way has your education, career, or personal experience been affected by the achievements of the women's movement? And what is your personal experience with the last thing you're breaking through? Combine those 2 together. So I'm going to start off with Laurie, if she's okay with that. Laurie?
Yeah.
Okay.
All within 5 minutes, right?
All within 5 minutes, yes.
All within 5 minutes. All right. Well, now, I don't need that. Can you guys all hear me? If I talk loud? Okay, good. Okay, well, my personal experience probably is the way I'm going to start it, because when I was a junior in college, 1970, so that dates me, I dropped out of school because actually that's when I started becoming involved in the women's movement. And I was involved at that particular point with starting the group of people who started the Women's Studies program at San Diego State, their first cultural event, Women's History, Women's Festival of the Arts, the Longest Revolution, was involved with helping the first women ex-offenders get on campus. We were involved with non-traditional jobs. I mean, I was involved with a whole lot of things because at that particular point, the revolution was happening, okay? We knew that there was going to be a change. I was 13 units away from graduating, and my education wasn't making any sense to me, and I dropped out to do more of the continuation of the work that I had been doing in terms of organizing. And went on working with the Center for Women's Studies and Services, which is now in existence still for the Center for Community Solutions. But I was involved with starting the first Rape Crisis Center, the Domestic Violence Hotline, all of these different things that were making sense at that particular time, because even though women were making progress, sexual assault was still going on. Rape statistics were still really high. The police were telling domestic violence situations that take the guy and they walk him around the block. Women were not having contraception, abortion. Before 1972, a woman had to get a psychiatric evaluation in order to get an abortion. She had to get someone signed saying that she would commit suicide if she did not get an abortion. So there were a lot of things that were going on. When we started the first non-traditional employment program for women here in San Diego, we were getting women who were going down to NASCO, which is the National Steel. They were building all the big ships, and they were earning more money than any other woman in San Diego. Because they were there being welders, they were there being riveters, they were being all of these things. Once we started getting women involved in that, guess what happened? They started to change the requirements for women physically. So instead of just having to lift 50 pounds, now you had to carry 50 pounds up a ladder into the hold of the ship and down. And they thought that they would get us out by doing that. Well, they didn't. We just simply created a program that helped women be able to do that. So my personal experience was in helping in San Diego to shape the women's movement, to create programs for women that did not exist. The hotline, the shelters, the rape crisis centers, the non-traditional jobs, the women's newspapers, the art, the culture, all of those things, the education. San Diego State has a women's studies program now because that's what we started. That was one of the very first things that we started, was there. And so my personal experience with glass ceilings, we shattered it. You know, that was the goal. That's what we did. And what it taught me, though, was that a group of people can make big changes. You know, you see a need and you do it. You get out there and you do it. Did we have discrimination? Sure we did. When we did the first Women's Arts Festival at San Diego State in the library, we had an exhibit that was controversial according to the librarians there. And they at night would come and take it away and hide it so that it wasn't going to be on display. So censorship basically. Oh, it was wild. So we would go and we would pull it back out and we'd put it back up, you know. God, I'll tell you, I can go on with all of these incredible stories about what it was like to change the way San Diego looked at women and what we did, what a group of people did. A group of people like you. I mean, I was 21 when this happened. And I'm still a feminist.
Thank you, Laurie. And we'll move to Sondra next. We have jumping around. Is that okay, Sondra?
Sure. Okay, so I would like to, before I start, just like those political candidates do, I do want to say one thing about something else. We mentioned Patsy Mink, who was a congresswoman in 1972, and I just want to say, as a former New York City person, and always a New York City person, we had Shirley Chisholm, who was in Congress in 1968, who was the first African-American woman in Congress, who said in 1982, right before she left Congress, that she had suffered more from discrimination as a woman than she did, she said, as a black. Because, quote, men are men, is what she said. So, she was from Brooklyn, and I'm from the Bronx, but it's okay. So, when the achievements of the women's movement absolutely impacted my career here at Mesa. I was for 17 years or so a site compliance officer, which means that I investigate incidents of discrimination. And interestingly, when I started, the discrimination cases I dealt with were mainly racial and religious. But by the time we got to the 1990s, they were mainly sex discrimination, gender discrimination, sexual harassment. And we took these seriously. And I say we took these seriously because I remember being back in school, and when some teacher or somebody started, touching you, okay? Started touching you, you didn't go and file a complaint anywhere. You sort of ducked, and you stayed out of the way, and you got to know which guys were the gropers and which weren't, and that's what you did. And it was really nice to be in this era where it was taken seriously, where it was investigated, where there were penalties about it. Though this was news to some people that were still in the grope era, I'd say. And then I also was affected, not only, I did that, but I'm also a professor of humanities, and I teach the introduction to the Old Testament. And you would think, well, women's movement didn't affect that very much. Wrong, because there's a book called The Woman's Bible, and it's written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This woman had immense amounts of energy, and when she wasn't agitating for the vote, she actually had gone through the Bible and noticed that what they were teaching her in church didn't actually match up with what was going on there. She was the first one that pointed out, Eve doesn't look bad in the Bible, actually. She's imaginative, and she's courageous, and you know why she takes that fruit. She said she wants to be smart, she this, that. Whereas Adam, who had specifically been told not to, it just says, he ate, with no reason whatsoever. And she, because of her, you now have women scholars from women's studies looking at the Bible in a different way. Because of her, the way I teach the Old Testament has absolutely been influenced. As you'll see, if you come on March 22nd, on Thursday at 5 o'clock, right back here, and we talk about Eve, the first feminist. So the women's movement has affected me both in how I teach, what I teach, and in this other role that I had as investigating cases of sexual harassment. And I'd like to say, on the good side, cases of sexual harassment have dropped tremendously from, say, 1994 to now. There's really been down. And it's because we've educated people, and they really get it now. When I first started out, they didn't. They said, well, it's really nothing. I mean, I'm a toucher, I like to touch. That's what they would say. And it was news to them that some people did not like to be touched, even if you like to touch. So things have gotten better on that front as well. So,
How's that? 5 minutes? Yes. I'm going to go to Thekima next.
Okay, I'm going to take a little different spin to the women's movement, because women are the basis for all culture, in terms of their foundation for all cultural peoples. When men have gone away and hunted and been leaders and been jailed, it's usually been the women who have been the ones who have carried on culture when the men have not been able to, or have stopped for whatever reason. As an African American woman, I have to say that the women's movement is different for me as an African American woman. The civil rights movement itself, as one kind of movement, opened the door for opportunities for the women's movement to do some things in late 20th century and mid 20th century that had not been able to be done before. We have Rosa Parks, we have, as was mentioned, Shirley Chisholm, and some other very important dynamic women. We can add Michelle Obama to that mix, who is changing the women's movement in tremendous ways. But I'm going to just say that for the Black experience in America, African women have not been able to exclusively separate themselves from the movement of equality with Black men. And that's been a double trying standard, if you will, because for Black women in America, we can't not fight for equality as a people and separate from men, and yet because we are women, we have a double whammy where we've had to fight separately for that issue, if you can follow me on that.
Yes.
And for the African experience in America, when men of color have been jailed, assassinated, women have had to carry that torch. So the whole idea of things like single parenthood or heads of household is not an uncommon phenomenon in the history of the African American woman's experience. Certainly their triumphs, despite the discrimination, has allowed a person like myself to be able to sit here before you today. My mother came through an era of time as a very smart, intelligent woman who could not get her tubes tied after her fourth child, who had to get permission from her husband to get her own credit card, who wasn't able to go to school without her uncle taking and signing off for that, even on the college level. And so when you ask me what's my personal experience, I've been heavily influenced by what we said with 4 daughters, with 3 daughters, that she wanted each and every one of us to be college educated, to be able to take care of ourselves and our children if we had to, and to not let the world stop us. I'd have to say my mother was probably much more, not any disrespect to my father because I'm a daddy's girl, but one of the smartest women I have ever known. And yet she couldn't invest in business. She couldn't get her own loan to buy an apartment complex when at that time in the 60s they were like $500, if you can imagine, for a down payment to buy an apartment complex with the kinds of thinking to take and be, wanted to be ahead in a middle class family setting. So to kind of wrap it up here, when we say, part of my other personal experience, I went to San Diego State University, so I'm an alumni there, and so I participated very heavily in the Black Student Union movement there to do some different kinds of things. I have a degree in economics, which was quite unusual at that time in the early 80s for a Black woman to be one of the few to sit in the class to get a degree in economics. And it was a challenge in the sense that lots of people looked at me in a double standard. One, what am I doing there as a woman? And two, as an African American, you couldn't possibly understand anything about economics, Keynesian theory, and things of that nature. So it was very difficult to get support from faculty and other people to take me seriously. So having support from family and being actively involved in things like Black Student Union, becoming politically involved, made a big difference in being able to stand up for the opportunities of women. And I'm going to just end by saying this, that if women didn't continue to take and support the efforts of their rights, then the culture of every people as we know it may not be in existence. Because women are the ones who carry on when nobody else will do it, or when they're not there to do it, and have had to do it whether they wanted to or not.
Hi, my name is Akunna, and she was talking about a double whammy. For me, it's even more, because when I get the discrimination is female, foreign, woman, Black, the whole thing. So sometimes I got to figure out which one they're doing. to know how to address it. With my, what influenced my education, it was my parents. My mother came from a family where my grandfather made a really good deal with the British when they came to Nigeria in the early 1900s. They were looking for land to build a hospital, and he didn't want money. He made a deal with them that his children would go to school for free. And he didn't even have a formal education, and he had a contract, a written contract, and that was for eternity. It wasn't like for 10 years or anything. And he was an only child, so he gave him a lot of land to build a hospital and a school, and elementary school, high school, and all that. So from there, his children went to school for free. So my mom was a nurse, one of the first nurses from our village. So the influence of that, going to school, was very, very, was a priority in my family. I come from a family of 10. There are 8 girls and 2 boys. My father was a police officer, my mom was a nurse, and then she left nursing and started businesses. So I never, she never said anything like women can do it. She just did it. I didn't hear the speech about, women can do it or men can't do it. She just did it. My mom had a lot of businesses. She used to. The first one I remember was, she had to teach me, because everybody learned at 8. You had to teach you how to keep the books, because she rented. We call them tippers, but they're dump trucks. From she rented dump trucks to construction sites, and they paid cash. She did not take checks. She did not take any bank notes. She just said, no, don't take anything but cash. So one of my early chores coming back from school was to count money, and I didn't know everybody else didn't do that. And she showed us how to count money. Everybody had their book. You had your own, tipper, your own dump truck. At the end of the day, all the money was there in a box. You had to count it and put it in a plastic, rubber band and enter it in the book. So I learned how to do a balance sheet by 8 years old. I didn't have a choice, And sometimes people say, well, did you get any of the money? It wasn't the culture there. What would I do with the money? You had everything you needed. What would I buy, with the money? So it was just your chore when you come back from school. And then another thing I saw my mom do, which, because she was educated, she could get into places that other women couldn't get. I remember, why did we, tie those bundles of money? Was because early the next morning she had people, she would go into the bushes, what they call the bushes, in the villages around. She had received a contract. She actually put in a bid for a contract for the prison nearby to supply vegetables, because the men didn't like to do that. So no women wanted to do it. So they were having problems getting vegetables for the prison. So she put in for the bid and got the contract. But then she, negotiated with them to have a 10-year contract instead of a 1-year contract. So they gave her a 10-year contract. So early in the morning, all those bundles of money we counted, she would take it with a lot of people on a big, big, big truck to go into the neighboring villages, because we lived in the city, buy all the vegetables and take them to the prison. So I saw my mom just do it way before Nike said that. I just didn't get any speech. So I never grew up with the idea that I couldn't do things. I just knew I could. I just had to, pick up which one it was. As for education, from my culture, the parents made the decision what you studied. It wasn't, choose. They just tell you you're going to do business, you're going to be an attorney, you're going to be a medical doctor, and we did it. Because they told us they knew better, so we believed them. So it wasn't that. One thing I remember my mom always said, and I wrote it down here just because it goes through my head, she always says, eliminate excuses, and you'll be amazed at how much you can do. And she always told us that. She didn't want to hear it. anytime, in fact, sometimes you stand in front of her to say something, she'll give you the look. You just go eliminate excuses, when you know what she meant. And because of that, I really, even when people discriminate against me when I came over here, I didn't know it. Somebody else had to tell me I was being discriminated against a few times. With school, I went to University of Washington. I remember clearly I wanted to go get a job at the student center. At that time, you could work with a student visa. And the supervisor there, she talked to me and she said, I would like to hire you, but I don't like black people. And I said, oh, okay. So I left and I went to the print shop and got a job. I didn't know it was wrong for her to say that. It didn't bother me. I figured I've been black a long time. But I didn't think it was the wrong thing. And then my friend was looking for me. He came up to me. She said, where were you? And I told her. She goes, what did you say? Then it became a thing. Oh my goodness. They had to organize a march, and the whole thing. And I told her, I can't march. I have to call my dad. Because coming to school in America was very expensive. My father was a police officer. If it got in the news, I was in trouble. I can't go to America and march. And they said, well, we're marching for you. And I go, wait a minute. If she doesn't like me, she doesn't like me. That's okay. And they told me, no, it wasn't okay. So the whole thing, I had to wait, and I went through the embassy. That was before cell phone. I called my dad, and my dad said, no. I didn't send you there to march, go to class. And I said, yes, sir. So my education here from college has been wonderful. I do go through things and I just deal with them as they come. No excuses.
We'll go to Cherie.
Hi, my name is Cherie. I have the pleasure of representing students at the district-wide, statewide, and here at Mesa College. I'm the Associated Student Government President. I also sit on this as a student trustee of the San Diego Community College Board of Trustees, and I also sit as a regional senator on the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. In terms of constituencies, I represent 26,000 students here at Mesa College, 124,000 students at the district, and all 9 colleges at the statewide level. I'm also an Asian American woman, if you haven't noticed, 21 years of age. I am the only female president in the district, and my counterparts, I love them to death, are over the age of 30, and they're white men. So I'm kind of the sore thumb kind of sticking out. At the statewide level, I'm only one of 9 women who sit on a board of 40 representing 2.6 million students, community college statewide. Myself, or anyone like myself, would not even begin to even fathom being in these positions today have not it been the women's movement and things that they've done historically. Today, I sit amongst men and I receive the same education, which is something that I would not be able to do 100 years ago. I also hold office, which is something that I would not have been able to do many years ago. The women's movement has pioneered and has created a pathway for today's women to further advance educationally and career-wise. And without those actions of those that come before me, and I would not be able to be here today. I'm only a product of the efforts of the women that have pioneered for the women today. In terms of personal experiences with the glass ceiling, the biggest thing that comes to my mind is a story of when I first stepped into Senate at the statewide level, and I was working in the Capitol, and I was speaking to one of the other regional senators, and mid-conversation, he says to me, you know what, I like you. When I work in the White House, I'm going to go ahead and make you one of my pretty little interns. And I was so taken aback by that statement that I respectfully said to him, I was like, last time I checked, we were doing the same job. And he says to me after that, he goes, you know, I like you. You're feisty. You can be my secretary. And, you know, going back to what Thekima was saying about discrimination, it's like, is he discriminating against me because the stigma of Asian women, or because I'm 21 years of age and I'm in a, you know, in an industry where everyone's 45 and up, or is it because I'm a woman in general? And so, I mean, the things that I face in my position, at my 3 different positions, it's really, really interesting to see, because we've pioneered and gone past so many different things outright, but there's still that deeply embedded psyche of how women are, we're not inferior, but that stigma and that psychological embedding of that statement has still shown its way through in today's society. And you know, it's not just like blatant, it's not blatant anymore, it's more underground, and it's more, you know, through the snide little remarks that people say to you on the daily as a woman, and being in these positions, it's just, it's made me realize that we still have the problem still here today. And as women in these positions, as educators, as a student, I see the value in trying to push forward and trying to see in 20 years, you know, hopefully how the generations come, because we've come such a long way in the past 20 years. So I'm excited to see where we're going in these 20 years, and hopefully that we can eliminate that embedded psychological thing that men have about being superior over women. So, thank you.
Before we move on to the next part of the presentation, are there any specific questions you have of our panelists right at this point in time? They'll be coming back again towards the end.
I know we talk a lot about racism and sexism and the people who are oppressing. What I get concerned about is the fact that we don't give a lot of time and energy to talking about how we have internalized sexism and how we become agents of our own oppression. And I see that a lot in my class. So I say, how many of you ever experienced sexism? And like 3 people will raise their hand. So can you speak a little bit about that in terms of how, or how you've noticed your peers or even yourself, how you had internalized sexism and what you did to get rid of it?
How do you get rid of it? I think panels like this, I think talking about it, you know, I think that it's part of not losing our history. You know, the fights that went on for equality all the way across the board, and bringing that into the present. The fact that we are still having I'll stop real soon. The fact that we are still questioning whether or not we can have contraception. I mean, you know, the fact that Virginia talks about having a vaginal wand before someone can get it inserted into their vagina, before they you know, have a medical procedure. You know, the fact that the healthcare system, when they do medical examinations or medical tests, use men as opposed to women, and women's body respond differently. We're just now starting to find those things out. Those are really, I mean, those are the things that we have to talk about. We have to keep bringing them up. Sorry, now I'll shut up.
Sorry, I wanted to respond to that question. As a young woman growing up in this society, in this day and age, I think some of the things that have really alarmed me about women's behavior in general is a couple of things, actually. One is, excuse my language, but how women refer to themselves. It's been a trend as bitches.
Right.
And
Right.
that is so counterproductive to all of the things that we have done, and I just think that education is the forefront of eliminating this, because I don't know if they really realize the implications of that word and how it internalizes to themselves and as a culture. And the second thing that really, really alarms me is how some women dress in terms of themselves, because a lot of times they think that, you know, like those short skirts or, you know, those really revealing tops, you know, they think it's cute or, you know, whatever. But at the same time, I feel that it's sending the wrong message, you know, because we have worked so hard to not be seen as meat markets or, you know, to be really, to be respected. And to command respect, you also have to carry yourself with respect. And so to respect your bodies and to respect your minds, to just really be, women have to be a lot more mindful about their actions and how they carry themselves, especially if we want to push forward and be respected in this society.
Okay. I'm going to add to that by saying that at some point we've got to stop assigning roles of what's a man's job or what's a woman's job, what's a female character, what's a man's character. For example, if you're a female and you have a flat tire, having information, this part of education isn't just formal education. How do I as a human being know how to take care of myself, be respectful to myself, and then in return I'll give respect back. So if I get a flat tire, instead of saying I can't change the tire because I'm a female, knowing how to do it so that I can get the job done. And that's just a small example of, you know, what I mean when I say, how do we not internalize oppressing ourselves or limiting ourselves in terms of what we can do or how we can do it. Another thing I think is really important is that there's a way. There was a book that Steve Harvey wrote, talked about think like a man and act like a woman. But how you think is how you'll act. So if you think like a man, you'll act like one. And what I'm advocating is that I don't have to see myself as being an important, valuable person in a man's persona in order to be valuable. And unfortunately, we live in a society that promotes women as having to be like men in order to be valued. And so part of to answer Starla's question, when you say, how do we overcome that? I got to know that I'm okay just the way I am, right? That I have to be accepting of who I am as a female and as a woman and as a bearer and giver of life. There's a wonderful book that's called The Great Cosmic Mother. It's a very powerful book that talks about the history of women in the world. And one of the things that it talks about is how women have been perceived around the world as bearers and givers of life, worshipped in many ways as goddesses and things like that. And that there's been an envy in men around the world who wanted to control life. And I think it's important to understand that as a woman who's given birth to 4 children, that being a bearer and giver of life is an awesome responsibility. And men can choose not to participate in that when they want to. But women don't always have that opportunity to choose whether we're going to take care of the life that we've given birth to. And in the same way that there's power behind that, the responsibility to nurture and develop it so that the rest of the human family becomes and sustained itself in a balanced way is something that requires us to think differently about each other. So women are going to have to take their power back. Men do not define what it means to be a woman, and women are going to have to take it, be embracing of that aspect of our truth and love that, not use it in a way that is counter-oppressive, because I think that's the fear that men have, that women are going to want to be oppressive to men the way that men have been oppressive to women. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's a state of consciousness.
I'm going to ask it that we kind of hold the questions, we've got a little bit more of the presentation to do. Then we'll get back to more statements and questions. Is that okay with everyone? So picking up here, the glass ceiling, in executive positions, though, you still find that women are underrepresented. 80% of executive positions are male, and when you look at CEOs of large companies in particular, there are very, very few women in those spots, less than 5% today. And if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, fewer than 3% of the CEOs are female. Women still are clustered in a relatively few number of fields, and so that limits their opportunity. They're things like teaching, healthcare, clerical work, social care, and sales. And those tend to be lower paid jobs. Men you will find in manual production jobs that you can expect. STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. Those tend to be higher paid. You also find fewer women in education, in things like engineering. Science, women are increasing in numbers in education. Engineering is still lagging. You will see men overrepresented in managerial positions, but the slide, a few slides before, showed that women are catching up there. The high-end positions tend to be mostly male. I want to turn to what's happened since 2008. The recession that occurred in 2008 and how that's impacted both women and men. Initially, the job losses in the recession were in fields that were predominantly male: construction, manufacturing, factories, clothing, and so on. So you saw women actually holding on to jobs, even though they were paid less well than men who were losing jobs. And the private sector was more impacted than the public sector. Public sector jobs held on. Things are reversing now. The economy is beginning to recover. There are more jobs coming into the private sector. Today there were largest number of new jobs that we've had in several months. But the public sector is suffering now. It's a lagging indicator usually. And what we have are teaching positions being laid off. So what you're getting are jobs that are often predominantly held by women now are beginning to suffer and will continue to suffer for the next couple of years as cities and school districts and government lays people off, whereas the private sector is beginning to recover. The poverty rate for women in the United States is 14.5% as of 2011, the highest it's been in 17 years. And a piece of information, the current income for a family of 4 at the poverty level is $22,350. I couldn't imagine trying to support a family of 4 on that amount of money. So when you look at that, 14.5% of women in the United States fall into that category. That's astonishing. It's incredible. And 1/4 of the children in the United States are in families in poverty. Again, that's astonishingly awful and bodes really badly for the future of this country. The recession, and not just the recession, but the past number of years, have led to role reversals between men and women. The end of the manufacturing era. You hear a great deal about the fact that we're losing manufacturing. Well, the United States still is a major manufacturing country, but the nature of manufacturing is changing. It's less hands-on and much more technologically oriented, computer-driven, so there are fewer jobs in manufacturing, and they're much more high-skilled. So you can't just walk in off the street with no skills and do the jobs that used to be there 20 years ago. So in 1950, 1 in 20 men in the United States was unemployed. Today, it's 1 in 5, due to this change in the nature and kind of manufacturing jobs that we have in this country. The jobs that are projected to grow in the next 15 years are things like janitor, but computer engineer. One very low paid, one which is very well paid, and those are male dominated. But the majority of jobs that are projected to grow in the next 15 years are things like nursing, home health care, childcare, food preparation. They're low income, but they're female dominated. So what you're getting is a shift in which the woman is the one in low income families who has work, and it's low income. Men can't find work because the low-skilled manufacturing jobs have disappeared and not coming back. So you begin to get into statistics on what's happening to families today. And there's quite a lot being written in the press currently, and a lot being said in electioneering about this. There's been a huge shift in the number of people who are married or not married, as the case may be. From 1960, 72% of adults over 18 were married. Today it's 51%. If you look at the age range 18 to 29, only 20% of adults in that age range are now married. However, although the marriage rates are going down, for high income, highly educated women, marriage rates are actually going up, which is very interesting because if you reflect back on something I said earlier, women used to have to be single if they wanted careers. They couldn't be married. Things have changed in that respect. Reasons, and here this comes from a research report done by two researchers, Stevenson and Wolfers, in 2007. So the reasons they cite for these changes in marriage and in the economy are things like birth control technology, liberalized divorce laws. Divorce used to be very difficult or almost impossible at one time. Labor-saving technology at home, of course. Education revolution. Women are now more educated than men on the average. Lesser need to marry for economic reasons. So women are making decisions, as are men, about when to marry based upon, can the person I might marry help support me? And so it oftentimes is put off until the economy of the couple improves. And there is much more of a social acceptance of cohabitation. So some of the writing that you'll see, the New York Times has a series of interesting articles recently, and some of the things they talk about are that upper income couples can afford to live out of wedlock, wait to get married until later, and they have the money to do what they need to do and put on childbearing. Lower income couples have very little flexibility in their lives. One thing going wrong pushes them over the edge. So they may postpone marriage, but then they had children and they postpone marriage till much later on, if ever at all. So this is some of the discussion that's driving the current Republican candidates in the debate. They are basically blaming the victims, whereas blaming the victims as opposed to looking at what's happened in the economy for individuals. There's a new book just being published by Charles Murray. I'm not supporting Charles Murray's thesis by any means. It's a book that's out there and is driving some of the debate. And he talks about two white communities. One he calls Fishtown and one he calls Belmont. And the Belmont is an upper middle class white community, and the Fishtown is the lower socioeconomic community. And he looks at the rates of marriage as being tremendously different between those two, and the number of children out of wedlock as being very large in the lower socioeconomic community of Fishtown. He then basically says there was something wrong with the morality of these communities. So he's blaming the victim. However, if you look at what's happened as a whole in society, in the economy, you can begin to see some underlying forces. So globalization over the past 20, 30 years, and technological changes have increased demands on workers. Unless they're more educated, they can't get and keep the kinds of jobs that are now current. Social decay makes it harder for them to meet those demands. So the kinds of issues that help to address this are not easy ones to change. They can't be turned on overnight. So for example, education is critical and training is critical. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a bachelor's degree, but you may need to have some further training above and beyond high school, particularly for the technological jobs in manufacturing. And one candidate for office has said, we don't need to send people to college. It's snobbish to send people to college. That's absolutely inimical to the growth of a good society where people are able to get and hold jobs. We don't need everybody to get degrees, but we do need people to have training. And many of the technological jobs need computer science background, they need math background, they need some physics knowledge, they need some engineering. So there's a fair degree of higher education that's needed. Adequate support systems for families are essential. Childcare is really a hit and miss effort for many people. You can look at some countries that have done much, much better in childcare. For example, if you look at a country that I am aware of, Bulgaria, which is where my son-in-law is from. It was originally a communist country. It's broken apart. It's from the communist from communism. It's still a country that is economically very, very challenged and has some major issues. But what they have is a tremendous care for children, and every town has major child care centres where women can leave their children from early in the morning until late in the evening if they need to. They have kitchens on the premises, food is cooked for children. They have separate rooms with beds for children to take naps. My own son-in-law was appalled when his children went to preschool, good preschool, and they had to lie on little mats on the dirty floor, as opposed to having this kind of place that really takes care of children. So we need available, good quality, high quality childcare, so people can feel comfortable that when they're at work or when they're going to school, and to improve their opportunities, that their children are taken care of. We need things like flex time at work, so people can be able to get free to take their children to doctor's appointments, to attend to after-school events. So we need a very different kind of system for work for people who have children. And many of us here, and maybe not all of us, some of you have lived the heartbreak of trying to deal with how do you balance your children. The child has a sniffly nose. Do you send them to school? Do you stay at home? What happens if you stay home? Who's going to do it? And that's a minor issue, let alone what happens when you have a really sick child to balance the demands. And healthcare. We need accessible, affordable healthcare. And who would have thought that in 2012 we would be reliving what we thought was settled a generation ago, the whole issue of contraception and abortion availability. It is quite unbelievable what's going on, and Sondra referred to that and may want to talk a little bit more about it. So this slide simply shows people in politics who are, we need good representation, and we do have representation, but it's not very good. 17% of the House of Representatives are women. 17 out of 100 senators are women. We've had very few women governors. I should say that we're making some progress. Throughout the world, there are a number of women in positions of power, including Hillary Clinton, U.S. Secretary of State. We've never had a president yet in this country who's a woman. We do have 3 Supreme Court justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Elena Kagan, and most recently, Sonia Sotomayor, was she the most recent one? Three. Newsweek, back in September, did a very interesting comparison using data on international comparisons. And of course, as one might expect, the top 10 nations are Western nations, many of them Scandinavian, Iceland, Sweden, Canada's not Scandinavian, Denmark, Finland, Switzerland, Norway, United States, Australia, Netherlands. And the characteristics of those are that they have democratically elected governments, they have strong economies, and they have chosen how they use their funding in their economies. And they have the inclusion of women. For example, in Norway, they have a law that at least 40% of people who sit on boards of directors of companies must be women. So they have a law to promote that. And it makes a difference. And in rich nations, women tend to have more higher education than men. The bottom 10 nations are usually failed states. They're largely dependent on foreign aid. Women are second-class citizens, have no voice in law or in actuality. And they basically are simply treated as chattels. In Afghanistan, there is a system known as BAAD, B-A-A-D, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, by which when families have disputes that can't be resolved by discussion, then they will resolve it by giving a woman, usually a young girl, away to the other family, and that's supposed to settle it. It's astonishingly awful. And it still exists. It's a remnant of when people in Afghanistan were nomads. It's not necessarily related to Muslims, but it's a remnant of what used to happen. It's still there. In many of those countries, women cannot go out alone without a man as an escort. They have little education. Their lives are very constrained. Worldwide, there are 3.9 million excess female deaths per year due to things like lack of adequate medical care, childbirth. Many women in poor countries die in childbirth who never should. Violence, such as wars, rapes. Rape is used as an instrument of war. Honor killings, and even in some first world countries, honor killings occur in groups that have immigrated to those countries. And then there's a strong preference in some countries for boys rather than girls. So girls are left to die upon birth, or they are aborted. Of the illiterate adults in the world, 2/3 are female. And there are some changes occurring worldwide though. In primary education, girls and boys are almost equal now. That's a really, really good sign. Secondary education, girls are still lagging, but they're beginning to catch up, and that's good. And now, as well as concern for girls, is concern for boys, disadvantaged boys and young men. And you saw that in some of the statistics I cited. Women don't do well if men don't do well. We're here together. We don't want to simply leave out one half of the world. Hillary Clinton, who is a great advocate for women worldwide, she says, when we liberate the economic potential of women, we elevate the economic potential of communities, nations, and the world. There's a stimulative and a ripple effect that kicks in when women have greater access to jobs and the economic lives of our countries. Greater political stability, fewer military conflicts, more food, more educational opportunity for children, and by harnessing the economic potential of all women, we boost opportunity for all people. And then one more quote. The president of the World Bank, Robert Zellick, says investing in girls is not just a good thing, but a smart thing to do. Some of the things that I looked at in putting this together are the World Development Report, Gender Equality and Development. It's about 500 pages, so I just read this executive summary. Women at Work, The Economist magazine report, Newsweek report. The Atlantic magazine is an interesting source for interesting, in-depth articles that look at research that's been done and then provide commentary. So one very interesting one is the death and life of marriage in America. That was recent. All the single ladies, that was interesting. The end of men. And then very recently, just this last week, the spectacular triumph of working women around the world. Some other books, I didn't mention Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex in 1953. She was a major thinker, a French thinker, who really looked at the sexual liberation of women. Very interesting person and writer. Two other books, Infidel by Ayan Hirsi Ali. Another one by Deborah Scroggins, looking at two women and their lives. And a Karenina, which isn't women's lit by any means, but it has a very interesting story. Tolstoy was a bit of a misogynist, but still the story is very interesting. So at this point, we'll turn to the panel's second question, and then we'll open it for all discussion. Let's take that question, and then we'll come to this. Okay.
I'm very appreciative of all the women's movement that they did back in the day that have led us to this point. I'm just kind of wondering what your guys' thought of is how we are going to continue to do that, because it seems like society's trends of how women are carrying themselves just in general and how we're still being perceived is almost backtracking, and
Yes.
the discussion in politics right now is about women's health and why do men still think that they can
Yes.
have that much control over us, and what will it take now to get past that at this age?
I think that's an absolutely key question. It basically ties into this
Right.
about critical issues. But certainly we've seen tremendous backtracking. It looks like people say, let's just go back to an earlier age, this golden age. So let me ask the panelists then to kind of address your question. As they address this, will that work? Yeah. Okay. Sondra wants to start.
I think it's not people wanting to go back. I think it's people who have never changed. I think what happens is a lot that happens with racism. It goes underground, and we've made it not the thing to say in public discourse, but it was there all the time, and you need very little to spark it. And then it's really shocking. The choice of language, as an English professor, someone mentioned the vaginal wand, right? The internal vaginal wand. Okay, if I think of wand, I think of a magician or a fairy godmother, This thing, this internal vaginal wand is, I don't know, vaginal rod, okay? That is shoved into you, that you have to have, that anyone would propose such a thing now. Or that you would have someone like Rush Limbaugh saying, and he is, I keep being told, the most listened to radio program that there is. Saying basically, women who want contraception, okay, do we call them a slut? Do we call them a prostitute? And the depth of ignorance is amazing, right? He thinks you need more contraceptive the more sex you have. He thinks it's something like Viagra, I'm guessing. And by the way, why are we funding Viagra? I'd like to know. There is, it's very interesting to me that nobody questions this at all, because it's a helpful male thing. But when it comes to contraception and women's health, we are. But the speed with which people have embraced this is shocking. It's just shocking that people are so marching backwards happily with banners waving. Or, okay, so Liz is not mentioning candidates' names, so I won't mention candidates' names either. But to introduce your wife is saying, she had a job, but now she just stays home because she's a homemaker and a mother. I think you don't have really good child care here, because somewhere is the idea is that if you were really a good mother, you would be home. You would be taking care of that child. And we should not have to, do this for you. So how do we fix this? I would say be very activist. Get out and vote. In a way, it's good. These people have revealed who they are, right? So what does it say then if, having revealed how they think and what they are, they actually prosper in getting votes? It means that because women, there are more women voters than there are male voters. And that should count for something. But very often it doesn't. And I read that the statistics on wives voting the way their husbands vote, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. So I don't know how we do this, but we should, right? We've got the edge in population. I don't know if, yes, we have the edge in voter registration. This should not be a problem, but it is.
Cherie would like to respond.
Oh, good. You
To
have
answer,
answers, right?
to answer your question, I believe the best thing that we could do as a society is to try to educate our women as much as possible about the different things that are going on. Because the curious thing about education is that you don't just gain an awareness of the things that are happening around you, you also gain a self-awareness through that. Through your education, through the things that you learn about the different things that are happening in the world and how that affects you as a person. And if there's something that's deficient in the world, if you're not afraid to go out and tackle that thing and address it and really say, like, this is what's happening and this is what needs to be done to fix it, I don't believe that anything could stop you. And so I feel that the best way of going about solving this problem, or the problems that we have as women, is to really become more educated and try to move forth in that, because the more we know, the more we grow, the more we'll be able to address the different things and really try to solve them and take steps towards moving forth as women and as people.
I'm going to go to Laurie next.
Yeah, just really quick, and I think it's a great question, and I've struggled with it since I've been involved with the women's movement now since 1970, that's 40 some odd years. And how is it that you pass that on? And one of the things I think is that people have mentioned earlier is understand when the victim is being blamed. And then you step up to the plate. And so I think that it's one of these things of if you feel it in your gut, it's probably right, and respond to it. I've seen the subtlety of what happens in terms of sexism. And so it comes from one of these things of, oh, well, I really didn't mean it. That's not what that's not really what I meant. And so, and this, and I have seen men and women who have turned around and taken exception to things like that statement. And I think that's where we have to really start understanding is where is that patriarchy in our own heads? Or, how is it that we link men and women to overcome sexism and racism? I mean, that has to happen. But women have to trust their guts. If you think it's wrong, it's probably wrong. And then say something about it. And if someone turns around to you and says, oh, come on, honey, that's really not what I meant.
Can't
Sort
you
of
take
like,
a joke?
can't you take a joke? Or feminists don't have a sense of humor. I've heard that forever. Anyway, and sort of like what Cherie was saying, it's probably right. Trust your guts. And that goes for men too. If you have a question about whether something's happening that is perhaps a subtle form of sexism, either respond or ask the woman standing next to you. We can think about that and then take it on.
I had a question about class and women's progress. So I have kind of a comment and a question. I'm not entirely clear about it, but I'll get around to it. Something like this. I think all of us are refreshed and see it as real progress, that there's more representation, even in California, but nationwide politically, right? More women senators, more women leaders. We need that. Who wouldn't argue for that as a sense of social progress, right, and justice? But when I do a quick survey in my head, I'm a little bit disturbed by the fact that a lot of women boxers, people I respect that are talented, educated, have all the tools. Boxer, Feinstein, Pelosi. You could even, throw in Thatcher. One. I've married people that are loaded, that are super affluent. So, what is my point? I'm wondering whether that, and that's not inherently bad or wrong, but I'm wondering if the fact that is the case, if that masks some real progress. You know what I'm saying? Because there's a class element there, so people will think, well, we have 20%, our aim is 40%, but there's so many talented women that are still being held back because they don't have that resource. And so I find that disturbing and problematic, at least in American politics and worldwide.
I just want to take and piggyback on that in combination with what you just said too. The status that women are experiencing in our nation is an imposed status. It's a socially, politically, and economically imposed state. So we talk about women being illiterate, we talk about them being in poverty. It's not because naturally women are in those states. There's something that's happening within the glass ceiling that's confining an equitable account, which I believe is part of what you're saying in terms of classism. So classism creates things like racism. It helps to fuel sexism, undoubtedly. And to get to what you were asking about, I think part of the way to resolve this, one thing women are going to have to do is stop being afraid of what men are going to think about them in terms of being more equal. Part of the thing that we do is women are afraid as a majority population that there won't be enough men who will love them. They're fearful of being rejectful. That's part of the sexism. How am I contributing to my own sexism by being fearful that people won't accept me if I want something different, something more, something equitable, something that's going to be more progressive in the best interest of everybody. And I think that's part of the education that all of us have talked about that needs to happen, not just for women, but for men too. In addition to that, we have these psychological fears about not being loved, right? Will there be a man who will love me, who I can still have children with or be married to, or be significantly tied to, if I take a position that will be revolutionary, that could be in the best interest of everybody. So these are some things that women are going to have to decide for ourselves. We can't look to men to take and liberate us when they're the ones who are contributing to the oppressive conditions in the first place. So, and I believe, in relationship to what you're saying, that there is significant benefit when women take and tie themselves to a man who's affluent, which advances where they are, and also, in many ways, creates confinements as to how far they're willing to go in terms of independent thinking, et cetera, et cetera. For black women, let me just jump there for a minute, you have a situation, let's look at Michelle Obama, for example. I don't believe any first lady in the world has been as oppressed as her in terms of how the media has taken and done things, talked about her derriere. We've had things like on Google where she's been portrayed as a monkey, and that there's been, literally, and that there hasn't been any serious retaliation for those kinds of oppressive images that have been perpetrated upon the nation's first lady. So for the black woman in America, we still have this challenge. But what I will say is that maybe we can look to some of the experiences of indigenous women, because the women's movement hasn't always been oppressive. Indigenous women in Native American cultures and in ancient African cultures have had very strong leadership roles. We've had matrilineal societies and matriarchies in various forms and fashions, had been part of military campaigns. So there is historical context in the human scheme that shows women as being in positions of power and authority and respected by men, European men, in various forms and fashions. So the dialogue has to be with women about how we're going to redefine ourselves, how we're going to be embracing of our truth, and how we're going to take and continue to be the leaders. And as I mentioned before, when all else fails and when the men have killed themselves, it's who's left behind. The women have been the caretakers of the young and the old, and everybody in between. And that's not, I'm not saying these things in a manner to say that women should elevate themselves in the same oppressive manner that men have been, but to be embracing of that truth and say, how do we take and redefine ourselves such that we call men to take and be respectful of us. And I'm going to end with this. If every woman decided, and this is, if we all remember the conference that happened, what was that, 2 years ago, with Maria Shriver teleported that in, and there was one of the women who was part of the panel who talked about how in a place in Africa, and I can't remember where it was, where the women had decided that the war was enough. And they just decided not to give relations to the men, to make them change. And it had a very powerful, impactful, immediate change when the women decided we're not going to take and give the business to the men. And that's power. And it wasn't in an oppressive way. It was in a way to say, you guys work this out. You make sure that you're not killing each other and the rest of us in the process. And then we can get back to the business of being family and communal and things like that. So they took the responsibility and took the fear away to say, we're going to be mutually empowered. I'm not going to give it to you until you decide to take and make it right out here. So I would just offer that those are some things that maybe we can do as part of the next step, is look at some of the things that are working in the rest of the world, look at our own history and the world history of the past, and then decide how we as women are going to take and define ourselves and tell the men, this is how we are to be called and how we are to be treated. And in that respect, we continue to give to the family and the development of all humanity.
I think, sure, Akunna speak, because she'll be waiting too.
Yeah, I really liked your question, because from a young person, we need to, go from here now. What do we do? Whatever happened before it happened, we can't change that, but we can change from here and keep changing and improving things. I would say, look at self. It starts with you. You have to like yourself. For people that come from another country, we see the opportunities here. Some people that live here or that are born here don't even see. We have so much opportunity here. Focus. You have to ask yourself, what do I want? Everything else is secondary. What do I want? Where am I going? You get there first, and then we see. Because if you don't get there, there are always going to be problems. You have to get to where you're going, so that if you get that degree and you apply for that job and somebody wants it, doesn't want you to get, then you can argue and say, I'm qualified to do this job. It's really difficult to argue when you're not qualified. You have to focus and get to where you're going, because the opportunities are there.
That's something that kind of scares me, is the way they're cutting education, and that's so halting. That why is our country continuing to cut education when we are not soaring in education? That's the way out of this.
That's true. I mean, it even gets to it, but we also have to address things as they come. I don't believe in waiting till next month or next year. I mean, if you bring something that's challenging to me, I'll deal with it. Because it's easier for me, because I can move on. I mean, I've had situations where people, I worked corporate for 20-something years before I went back to academia. So I've had situations where people don't have time to stab you in the back. They stab you while you're right there. And you have to deal with it real quick. And I was in a boardroom for 14 years. I was the only female. And I remember this, another executive just blatantly, it told me I was, you're a double token. And I thought, and I said, yeah, I'm a double token because you applied for this job and didn't get it. And that was that. It wasn't because I wanted to be mean, but that was the fact. He applied for it, didn't get it, now I'm a double token. Yeah, I make more money than you. So let's move on. But we have to get to a point where you are prepared to do what you're doing, and just, kind of let things fall off your shoulders. You gotta get to where you're going first. Because if you look at everybody around, if you don't like yourself, it's going to be a problem. If you like yourself, if people don't like you, that's their problem. You have to, that's my attitude. I like me. If you don't like me, you got a problem. Go fix it. Because I like me.
I'm going to tell a little short story. Just 4 or 5 years ago, my daughters were in the kitchen. It was a teaching moment. My daughters were both in high school. The older one said, the Spanish teacher had been arrested for having a relationship with a senior girl. My daughter said, you know what sucks, Mom, is that if she were just 3 months older, it wouldn't be nothing to me. And that's her quote. And it was a teaching moment. I thought, wait a minute, she had internalized in some ways, and it really disturbed me. And I thought, well, we need to have a little talk about this, and quite a conversation in the kitchen. But in many other ways, I see people internalize place. Like, for example, I took a management job here at the college years ago. One of my colleagues, a woman, said to me, well, now you have to start dressing like a dean. Well, which for me meant looking like a man, because of all the things I'd ever met with men. And I thought, and that was from another woman. But for me, I think it's easy to get lazy and not talk about what we really believe in. And I think that to continue a dialogue is the first place to start when we talk about change or maintaining a place where we are in our development. And so for me, I'm really grateful for this panel and this conversation.
I really want to reinforce what Jody just said about us coming together and having conversation. Because one of the things I love about teaching the sexism and racism class is in one semester I get to watch young women change the way they dress even come into class. Because they have a different concept of who they are. And the concept comes from understanding how they're being programmed externally to put on those outfits, to put on those things they call shoes. It looks like pieces of art, but you can't walk in them. It's about really having those dialogues and starting very young, because I have a granddaughter. She's 10. And after she watches Disney, I have to remind her she's not a television character. It impacts them so subliminally. And so as we have dialogues with each other and bring to our consciousness the things that, we talk about things like female circumcision and, oh my God, that's so awful. Well, that's called a breast implant in America. If we can't connect the dots and understand that there are men's thought forms that are all over the planet that tell women how to be women, rather than from the inside out as women saying, this is who we are. And I think men really want to know who we are, but our voice isn't out there, so they're not hearing it. So they're hearing other men say, well, this, I'll give one quick example. In my sexism, racism class, I talk about Hooters. I know lots of women who have eaten at Hooters. I've never been inside. I know women who have worked at Hooters. I said, okay, if I'm made king, and because you got to be a man, so if I'm made king, and I decide to open my store that has really good wings, because that's why people say they go for the wings, and I call it Dingalings, would you take your son? And they're real clear they're not taking their son to Dingalings. So why in the world, as women, do we go on a date to Hooters? Do you understand what I'm saying? But it's not in our consciousness, it's in our subconscious. And I think we have to start bringing these things to the conscious, because that's when the behavior for men and women will begin to change.
That sometimes, even when those things are subconscious, there are those who do feel uncomfortable and just won't say no. And that gets back to the fear that I was talking about. Well, I really want to go on a date, and he really wants to take me, so it's not harming me conceding to that idea. It really isn't so bad, and we contribute to that through our own fears. And so at some point, we gotta stop being afraid to say no. We gotta stop being afraid to say, what's wrong with this picture? And, is that something that I would want my 5-year-old? And I'm just gonna piggyback on that. A friend of mine took her son had a birthday party just several weeks ago, and he wanted to have a party at Hooters. And the mother says, well, we're going there because of the food. It's not, a big deal because we like the food from there. And my thought was, you're going to take a 12-year-old who's turning 13 to an adult place, and he's having a party that he's inviting other children. So I say that to say, lynching in America in the 20th century, which still continues, was fueled by taking children to lynchings for picnics and family gatherings. And so no matter what the venue is, when you start taking children as an indoctrination that it's okay, in the same way that we allow our children to play video games, Grand Theft Auto, etc. You get 500 points for running somebody over. And the lack of their development, cognitive development, to know the difference between reality and virtual reality. And I'm just going to say this, whose responsibility is it? It's not the child's responsibility, it's we as the adults. It's our responsibility to set the boundaries. And I tell my students all the time, you're here to learn things that you don't know. So it's okay if you don't get it right, because our job here at the institution is to help you get it right? And so we have to take that responsibilities as the keepers of our democracy and the keepers of our humanity.
I just real quick, and that's that, I want to say something about the issue of what women wear, is that in a society that did not view women as an object, we wouldn't give a rat's patootie what we wore.
Right.
And so what we have to understand, I think, is that it's not what women wear or what men wear, it's the way that it's viewed. It's the patriarchal view of what it is that we now wear. And so I think that's the level that it has to be addressed on. Women make a choice about what it is that they wear based on what they perceive to be what is wanted them to wear. Now, we can raise that consciousness and then they can choose to wear something different. But in a world where that oppression doesn't exist, we could wear heels that were this big, or, you know, run around with no shirts on, or whatever else it might be. But we can't do that in a patriarchal society on that level. So it's the same concept with rape. You know, that how many times we still hear when sexual assault, it's what she was wearing. If she wasn't wearing this, or if she hadn't gotten drunk, or if she hadn't done that. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with that. It has simply to do with the way that women are viewed.
But we as women have to say that that's wrong, it's not acceptable, and we're not going to tolerate it, and we're not going to be engaging with people who take and have those perceptions. You can't control other people's thoughts, but you can say that I'm not going to take and allow myself to be violated by that behavior. And ultimately, people will ultimately choose to either continue it or not to continue it based on how we respond by saying we will accept it or not. So yes, because there are plenty of indigenous cultures who go braless or whatever you want to say, and it's not looked at as being vulgar. It's a natural phenomenon. And I tell my students when we talk about issues of versus sex and race, breasts are for little babies, not for big ones. So with people who have real issues behind women being nursing in a society, when the nursing act is a very natural act, it shouldn't be perceived as something vulgar, because it's really for the health of the child, better than any bottle that you could give them. And that, again, is a testament to what Laurie's saying in terms of how our society and our culture, what its values are. So as the givers of culture and the sustainers of culture, we're going to have to be redefining that and take that power back and just say no. And then also say, this is what is acceptable. This is what we think is important. And as such, do it in collaboration with men as well. Not to do what they do, but then just to say, this behavior is not going to be acceptable.
And I know we're at the time, but I just wanted to mention, looking at the global, a sense where we've come, and just because I still work with a lot of places in Africa, let me tell you, remember the micro loans? We started doing micro loans before it was called micro loans. And we've had records, because I work with some non-profit organization, 100% of the women pay back in half the time. 100%. As opposed to 25% of the men we give money. Because they always have some story, what happened to the money. And now we're even beginning to think, should we stop giving it to the men? Every single woman we've given a loan, $100 here, $50 here, $200 here. They use it, they keep their records, we show them how, they pay back half the time. The men, it's a problem. And it's not because they're not intelligent or anything, it's because they take it for granted that, what are you going to do? You gave me the money, I didn't ask you, even though they asked.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I really, really want to thank the panelists, every one of them. I think their own stories and their backgrounds have been really insightful and illuminating. So please join me in a round of applause.
Just want to say concluding remarks. Yes, we appreciate immensely everybody's effort, and I think it's been really an amazing event.
Oh, before we go, I just wanted to thank everyone for being here, but not just the women, but especially the men for being here.
And for staying.
And for staying the whole time, because you guys are the ones that are really progressive, and you guys have been listening to us say, oh, women, women, women. But thank you guys, men, for being here.